It was just an ordinary morning when my neighbor knocked on my door. But little did I know that one simple favor would turn into something none of us ever expected. As I opened the door, there he was, standing with a look of urgency on his face, holding something in his hand. He asked for a favor, a request so small, yet so powerful, that it would alter the course of our lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. This was the beginning of a chain of events that would change everything. I had always known my neighbor to be quiet, reserved, and a little distant. He kept to himself, just like most people in our neighborhood. We'd exchanged pleasantries, maybe shared a few conversations over the fence, but there was never anything more. So, when he showed up on my doorstep asking for help, it caught me completely off guard. At first, I thought it was just a simple request, something that wouldn't take more than a few minutes of my time. But as I listened to him explain, something in his eyes told me this was more than just a casual favor. He was nervous, almost desperate, and there was an air of secrecy that hung around him. He wasn't telling me everything. Still, I felt compelled to help him. Maybe it was the way he asked, or maybe it was the curiosity that started to grow inside me. I agreed. I had no idea that saying yes would lead me down a path I couldn't have predicted. The favor seemed harmless at first. He needed me to hold on to something for a little while, a box, a simple, unassuming box. But what was inside that box? And why did he seem so worried about it? These questions swirled in my mind, but I pushed them aside. I trusted my neighbor. What harm could there be? But as the day unfolded, everything started to unravel. The box wasn't just any box. It was a key to something bigger, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. I found myself in a situation where I couldn't back out, where I had to make decisions I wasn't prepared for. The more I tried to understand, the deeper I got pulled into a web of secrets, lies, and unexpected twists. It felt like my life and the lives of those around me were spiraling out of control. What was in that box? Why did my neighbor need my help? And what would happen if I went any further down this rabbit hole? These were the questions that haunted me as I took the first steps into a world I never knew existed. And just when I thought I had it all figured out, something happened that changed everything again. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where things take an even more unexpected turn. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. As the hours passed, I kept glancing at the box. It sat on my kitchen table, completely ordinary looking from the outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was holding something much bigger than what its size suggested. I kept telling myself that maybe it was nothing, maybe I was overthinking things, but I couldn't help it. My mind kept going back to the look on my neighbor's face when he handed it to me, almost like he was handing over a piece of himself. I tried to focus on other things, hoping it would distract me, but it wasn't working. My curiosity was eating at me. What could he possibly need me to hold on to? Why couldn't he just keep it himself? The more I thought about it, the more questions started to pile up. I had lived in this neighborhood for years, and I'd never suspected anything unusual about my neighbor. But now I began to wonder if I had missed something. Was there more to him than I realized? Later that evening, as I sat on the couch, staring at the box, I heard a knock on the door again. This time, it wasn't my neighbor, but a stranger. I didn't recognize the man standing there, and he looked out of place. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and had a certain intensity about him that made me uncomfortable right away. He introduced himself as someone who was just looking for something, though he didn't say exactly what. There was something in his voice, something unsettling, that made my heart race. My instincts told me that something wasn't right. Before I could say anything, he glanced at the kitchen table and then back at me. "Is that the box?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. I froze. How could he possibly know about the box? I hadn't even mentioned it to anyone. My mind raced, but I stayed calm, at least on the outside. I gave him a simple, polite answer. No, I don't know what you're talking about. The man didn't seem convinced. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine, as if sizing me up. You know, he said, some things are better left alone. You might want to think twice before you get involved. His warning felt like a heavy weight hanging in the air. I wanted to slam the door in his face, but something in his demeanor kept me rooted to the spot. Was he just some random stranger? Or was he connected to whatever my neighbor had gotten me involved in? Was he here because of the box? The stranger left without another word, but that only deepened the mystery. Why had he come? Why had he seemed so sure about the box? I couldn't ignore the feeling that my life had just taken a turn toward something I wasn't prepared for. As the night grew darker, I sat staring at the box once more, my mind spinning with questions, none of which I had answers for. But one thing was clear, I was already in too deep. There was no turning back now. The next morning, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my gut. The stranger's words echoed in my head, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I kept thinking about how he seemed to know something about the box, something I still didn't understand. The fact that he'd shown up out of nowhere, just after my neighbor had asked for my help, felt more than just coincidence. It felt like I had been caught in the middle of something much bigger than myself, something that involved people I didn't even know. I decided to go see my neighbor. Maybe I could get some answers, or at least get a clearer sense of what I was dealing with. But when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I waited for a while, but nothing. It was like he had vanished. A part of me started to wonder if he'd ever intended to come back. Maybe he had just used me as a pawn in some larger game, and now that he'd set things in motion, he was gone for good. I couldn't let it go. I had to find out what was really going on. The box. What was inside it? What was it connected to? I knew I was walking a fine line, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't back out now. The strange man, my missing neighbor, and that box were all pieces of a puzzle I needed to solve. But as I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at my neighbor's house, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. That's when I noticed something strange. A car was parked just across the street, hidden behind some trees. I hadn't seen it before, and it didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. As I watched, I saw a shadow move in the front seat. Someone was watching, and that someone wasn't going to let me walk away from this mystery so easily. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the car across the street. The figure inside remained still, almost like a shadow, blending into the darkness of the vehicle. Whoever it was, they were watching me. I tried to act casual, as if I hadn't noticed, but every instinct inside me screamed that I was being followed, that the walls were closing in. I slowly turned and walked back to my house, keeping my eyes on the car through the corner of my vision. It was like a game now, but the stakes were too high. My neighbor was gone, the stranger had warned me, and I couldn't trust anyone. What had I gotten myself into? I couldn't just stand there and wait for something to happen. I had to make a move. I went back to the box. It still sat on the kitchen table, untouched. The quiet weight of it was almost suffocating now. I couldn't just keep holding it. I had to know what was inside. But just as I reached for it, the doorbell rang. My pulse skipped a beat. Who could it be? My heart raced as I walked slowly to the door. Was it the stranger, my neighbor, or someone else entire? I opened the door, and standing there, looking like they had been waiting for this moment, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and had a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Without a word, he stepped forward, pushing past me and into the house. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't answer. My mind raced. How did he know about the box? Was he working with the stranger? Or was this a whole new player in whatever twisted game I had been pulled into? The man didn't wait for a response. He moved closer, his hand outstretched. The tension was unbearable, and I realized then that everything was about to change. The man's hand reached toward the box, but just before his fingers made contact, the door slammed open behind us. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat to find a familiar face. My neighbor, but not the same one I had known. This man, this stranger who had just appeared in the doorway, looked exactly like the one who had asked me for the favor the day before. But there was something off about him. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid, and his expression was unreadable. It felt like I was staring at a completely different person. Ely? The man who had been standing next to me froze, his hands still suspended in midair, as he looked back at the new arrival. A strange tension filled the room, and for a moment, no one moved or spoke. The air was thick with uncertainty, and my mind raced. What was going on? Who were these people, and what did they want with me? The man at the door spoke first, his voice low and steely. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, and the words sent a chill down my spine. The look that passed between the two men wasn't one of surprise. It was one of recognition, as if they were two sides of the same coin. The man who had been searching for the box turned his eyes back to me, narrowing. "You should have handed it over when you had the chance," he said, stepping closer. His voice was venomous now, laced with frustration. "This is bigger than you, and you have no idea what you're dealing with." I felt a growing sense of dread as the walls seemed to close in on me. The box, the strange warning, the disappearing neighbor, it was all starting to make sense in a way that scared me to the core. These men weren't just random strangers. They were part of something much bigger, something I had stumbled into by accident. I had unknowingly walked into the middle of a dangerous game, and now I was tangled in it. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite myself. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the box, and for a brief moment, there was something almost desperate in his eyes. Before I could react, the man who had just entered the house moved with lightning speed, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it. I barely had time to process what had happened before he turned to face the other man, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "You think you can stop this? You think you have control?" The tension reached a breaking point. I was caught between two dangerous strangers, each with their own agenda, and all I had was a mysterious box that seemed to hold the answers I couldn't begin to understand. The air was thick with anticipation, and I realized then that whatever was about to happen would push everything into uncharted territory. There was no turning back now. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me as the two men stared each other down, their eyes filled with a mix of distrust and barely contained hostility. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but it was clear that whatever was in that box had set something in motion that neither of them could control. The man who had entered the house, the one who had looked like my neighbor but wasn't, moved slowly toward the table. His gaze never left the other man, who stood frozen in place, watching him with growing apprehension. I could sense that something was about to snap. But just before anything could happen, I took a step forward, my voice shaking but determined. "What is this all about? What's in the box?" The man at the door let out a deep, exasperated sigh, as if he had been waiting for me to ask. He walked closer to the table, his eyes briefly flickering to me. "It's the key," he said, his voice steady but filled with something dark. The key to everything. You're involved now, and there's no going back. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could feel the danger escalating. The man who had been searching for the box stepped forward, his face contorted in anger. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat. "That box is the last piece. It's everything we've worked for, everything we've waited for, and now you're standing in the way." Before I could process what was happening, the man at the door snapped his fingers, and a hidden compartment in the wall opened up with a soft click. I watched in shock as a hidden safe slid open, revealing a set of papers, maps, and photographs, everything they'd been fighting for. But just as the other man lunged toward it, something incredible happened. The box, which had been sitting innocently on the table, suddenly clicked open on its own. A soft light began to glow from within, illuminating the entire room. I froze. The documents in the safe didn't matter anymore. Whatever was inside that box was far more powerful than I could have ever imagined. The man who had entered the house rushed forward, but the glow from the box intensified. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. And then, in a flash of light, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was alone in the room. The box was gone. The men were gone. It was like none of it had ever happened. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had just occurred, but there was no answer. Had I been a pawn in something much bigger? Had I ever really been in control? The silence that followed was deafening, and as I stood there, trying to comprehend the impossible, I realized one thing. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved. The box had been a key, but not to what I thought. It had unlocked something deeper, something far beyond anything I could have ever understood. And as the room around me began to fade into the shadows, I couldn't help but wonder, had the real game only just begun? The silence in the room felt oppressive. The glow from the box had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing behind but the eerie remnants of what had just happened. I stood there, my heart still racing, as I tried to make sense of it all. The men, my neighbor, the stranger, the glowing box, they were gone, as if they had never existed. It was as if the entire ordeal had been a bad dream, and now I was left with nothing but questions. I walked slowly to the spot where the box had been, my hands trembling. There was no sign of it, no trace of the events that had unfolded in the last 24 hours. It was like the mystery had vanished into thin air. But even though the physical evidence was gone, the memory of what had happened lingered in my mind, haunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a part of something far bigger than I could comprehend. Something that, for reasons I would never fully understand, had come to an abrupt end. I went back to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The car that had been parked across from my house was gone too, leaving behind only the fading memory of its shadowy figure. It felt as though the entire world had moved on, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The truth was, I'd been changed. The experience had opened my eyes to a side of life I hadn't even known existed. I wasn't the same person I had been when I answered that knock at the door. I sat down, trying to put the pieces together. The box had been a key to something larger, something that had been hidden right under my nose. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I had a feeling that if I kept searching, if I kept digging, I might find answers. But as I thought about the events, I realized something else. Maybe some things were never meant to be solved. Maybe the mystery of the box, the strange men, and the secret they had been chasing was meant to remain a mystery. Because in the end, some questions don't need answers. They just make us reflect on the world around us and the things we might never understand. And that, in itself, was the biggest twist of all. I leaned back, taking a deep breath. The story might have ended for now, but in my heart, I knew that I'd always be wondering what could have been. And that, I realized, was the real price of curiosity, the price of seeking answers to mysteries that were never meant to be solved. The box was gone, but its impact on my life would remain forever.